Well, hello, everyone. I want to thank you so much for having me here today to talk a little bit about Washington, D.C. and its monuments. I know that some of you participated in an event this morning about the Galapagos Islands. This is something completely different. So you're little world travelers today. First, a little bit about me. I'm not from DC. I'm actually, even though my background on my video makes it look like I'm in the Oval Office right now, I'm actually from and broadcasting from my hometown of St. Louis. One of my jobs that I hold is as a tour guide. I give tours in St. Louis for the St. Louis Cardinals, as well as for the St. Louis Holocaust Museum and Learning Center. But in the spring, is what really gives me joy. I am a tour guide in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., for school groups. So I will meet school groups in D.C., and I will usually be with them for about 3 days. So I'm actually supposed to be in D.C. in a couple of days, but all of my tours, due to current situations, have been canceled. So the silver lining is I get to be with you today. Now, of course, we obviously don't have 3 days, which is normally what the length of one of my tours is. So I just pulled out a few interesting little stories, trivia facts about some of my favorite monuments and spaces in DC, so that you can learn a little bit more about some of these places you've probably seen on TV or maybe in person for years, and you'll get to learn a little bit something new about them. So we'll take about 30 to 40 minutes to go through that. So if you're ready, here we go. We're going to start off looking at what is probably one of the most iconic structures in the world. At 555 feet tall and 1/8 of an inch, it is the Washington Monument. Now, DC is full of monuments and memorials. So what is the difference between a memorial and a monument? If something is a memorial, that means that plans for that structure to be built were created after someone, the subject, died. The fact that this is the Washington Monument tells us that plans for this structure were drawn up while George Washington was still alive, as opposed to other memorials like the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial, the Martin Luther King Memorial. That tells us that all those structures were planned after those individuals had died. Now, George Washington never got to live long enough to actually see construction start on the Washington Monument, but he at least was still alive as plans were drawn up. Now, the original plans for the Washington Monument were a lot different than that structure you're used to seeing now. The original plans looked something like this. It called for a 600-foot tall column that was flat at the top, surrounded by a colonnade of 100-foot tall columns, a big, larger-than-life statue of George Washington driving a chariot, and then 30-foot tall statues of Revolutionary War heroes. So very different than what we ended up having. The fact that the Washington Monument does not look like that original plan is that that original plan cost too much money. So they had to scale it back to be the nearly 600-foot tall obelisk that we know today. So a little bit more simple. Now, July 4th, 1848, they had the cornerstone laying ceremony for the Washington Monument. It was attended by many notable people: President Polk, Alexander Hamilton's wife, Eliza Schuyler Hamilton, who helped raise money for the Washington Monument, was there, as well as a little-known Illinois senator named Abraham Lincoln. They were all there to see the cornerstone be laid. And then construction started. And they were building until they got to about a third of the way up, and then construction had to halt. Why? Because they ran out of money. And the Washington Monument sat, as you see in that picture, unfinished for half a century. And it got a lot of ridicule. Writer Mark Twain once referred to it and renamed it sarcastically as the National Chimney because of what it looked like. But it sat unfinished for half a century until 1876. There was a great interest in raising more money to finish it. Now, why is that significant that year, 1876, we think? It is, of course, the centennial, the 100th birthday of America. So people were feeling very patriotic, and they said, let's finish this thing up. So they raised enough money to start construction again. The only trouble is, in that 50-year span, the quarry where they had gotten the original stone had closed. So they had to go to another stone quarry to be able to finish it. The only trouble being that the color of the stone from the new quarry was slightly different than the old stone. So if you look at the monument today, especially when you're in person, you will see that the bottom third of the monument is actually a different color than the top 2/3 of it. You can see a little bit of that in this picture that we see here, but really in person, when the daylight is shining on it, you can see where that original third was. So when this was finished up, the tippy top part of the Washington Monument is actually made of aluminum. Aluminum back in the 19th century was as rare and as precious as silver. So they wanted to top it with this precious metal, aluminum. Now, it actually was the largest chunk of aluminum ever founded, I guess you would say. They actually had it on display for a short time at Tiffany & Company jewelry store in New York City, where guests to Tiffany's could actually step over that chunk of aluminum so they could tell people and have bragging rights that they had stepped over the top of the Washington Monument. But when that tippy top of the aluminum was added to the monument, to finish it up at 555 feet and 1/8 of an inch, the Washington Monument became the tallest structure in the world, a title that it held on to for a whopping 4 years until it was beaten by this little structure in Paris, France, the Eiffel Tower, that is twice as tall as the Washington Monument. So just down the street from the Washington Monument is, of course, our beautiful U.S. Capitol building. Now, when the U.S. Capitol building first opened, it looked a lot different than it does today. It looked like this. Chiefly, it was missing its iconic giant dome in the center. That wasn't added until the administration of Abraham Lincoln. Now, when Lincoln wanted the dome built, he had a bit of a roadblock. He couldn't just snap his fingers or sign an order and have the dome built. He had to get approval from the Secretary of Defense. Now, ironically, the Secretary of Defense that he needed to get approval from was this gentleman. If you're a history buff, you may know that gentleman is Jefferson Davis, soon to become the president of the Confederate States of America when the South secedes from the Union. So Lincoln has to get approval from him to get the dome built. He initially does not give his approval because of the statue, the 19-foot tall Statue of Freedom that was to go on top of the dome. Now, Jefferson Davis didn't have issues with the statue itself necessarily. More it was what she was planning to wear. The original sculptor had planned to sculpt her wearing this, something known as a Liberty cap, this simple folded stocking cap. And what the controversy was is Liberty caps were what were given in ancient Rome to recently freed slaves to designate them as a free citizen. Jefferson Davis, of course, is about to become president of the Confederacy, and he throws a hissy fit over anything that is evocative, speaking towards the freedom of slaves. So he said, as long as that statue is wearing that hat, I will not give approval. So the designer went back to the drawing board and eventually gave the statue this more militaristic feathered headdress that she wears today. So you will find her at the top of the dome, and she is facing east. She is facing away from the National Mall. That way it is said that the sun never sets on freedom. Now, the dome was constructed during the Lincoln administration, and he ordered that construction continue through the Civil War. So construction never halted, even as that war raged with deadly consequences, because he saw the construction of the dome as a very important symbol, that as long as people could see the dome still being under construction, it means that the federal government is resilient, and it is going on, and it has permanence. And it eventually got finished, and boy, does it look nice. That dome is the third largest dome in the entire world. The only two domes that are larger than it are St. Paul's Cathedral in London and St. Peter's Basilica at the Vatican. Now, this picture right here is a beautiful image, and this is the side that is facing the National Mall. The wing that is off to the left of this photo is the wing that houses the Senate. The wing that is off to the right is the wing that houses the House of Representatives. Now, what's interesting about this, and I'm going to let you in on a little secret, is I can tell just by looking at this photo, even though I don't know what day this photo was taken, that the Senate was in session that day and the House was not in session that day. Why? Because on the top of both of those wings, there's a flagpole. You'll notice above the Senate wing of the Capitol, there's a flag flying from the flagpole. Now, a whole bunch of our screens are blocking the House of Representatives, but just take my word for it that the flagpole on top of the House of Representatives in this picture is empty, which means that they were not in session. So the next time you see the Capitol building on television, or if you're there in person, look at the flagpoles and you'll be able to tell whether the Senate or House are in session or not. Right across the street from the Capitol is this beautiful building. It is the Library of Congress. The outside of the building is beautiful, but take a look at their main reading room. Isn't that nice? Now, this is no typical library. This library has 838 miles of bookshelves. They have 167 million items, 39 million of which are books in their collection. That is a huge collection. Part of their collection includes a Gutenberg Bible. It includes a rough draft of the Declaration of Independence. It includes the first map that ever contained the word America on it. The largest book in their collection is actually 5 feet by 7 feet tall. It is a book filled with pictures of the nation of Bhutan. On the other side of the spectrum, their smallest book in their collection is a book that tells the story of Old King Cole, and it is the size of a period at the end of a sentence. That's how small that book is. It is a beautiful place, and they have 167 million items, but 12,000 items are added to the collection every single day. It's a pretty fascinating place. Now, on the other side of the National Mall is this beautiful structure, one of the most iconic memorials in the world. It is the Lincoln Memorial. You see it every time you stare at the back of a penny or the back of a $5 bill. It was the site of many iconic moments of history, including, of course, Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. Now, when there was an idea to have a memorial dedicated to the memory of Abraham Lincoln, there was much controversy as to what that memorial was going to look like. There were a lot of people who said it needs to be a log cabin. Abraham Lincoln was a humble guy with modest beginnings. His memorial should be the same. It should be a simple, modest log cabin. You had the people on the other side of the spectrum who said, no, he needs to be enshrined in a Greek temple. And you can obviously see what side won out. He is enshrined in a Greek temple. The symbolism, of course, being Greece was the birthplace of democracy, and Abraham Lincoln was the savior of democracy. He saved democracy during the Civil War. Now, there is symbolism in every detail of every monument or memorial in Washington, D.C. For instance, this memorial is made up of 36 columns that represent the 36 states that were part of the Union when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. Atop the memorial is what's called the attic. If you see my little cursor arrow up there, this is the attic. And there are the names of the 48 states that were in the Union when this memorial was dedicated in 1922. Of course, Alaska and Hawaii had not joined us yet, so their names do not appear up here. Now, when the memorial was dedicated in 1922, this is an image from that dedication ceremony. In an ironically sad bit of history, this memorial dedicated to the man who emancipated the slaves, this memorial was dedicated to a segregated crowd. Now, the man who dedicated the memorial was this guy, Robert Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's son and only surviving son. He was 78 years old when he dedicated the memorial, and that's what he looked like right there. Now, the memorial architect was a guy named Henry Bacon. If you go into the memorial and immediately turn to the left, there's a large carving of the Gettysburg Address carved into the wall. Above that is this painting. And as a sort of a Where's Waldo, the designer of the memorial hid himself. So in that red circle there is the image of Henry Bacon hidden in that painting. Now, the statue of Abraham Lincoln itself is 19 feet tall, and it has a bit of symbolism in itself. You will notice in his hands in particular, you have one side that is a fist, speaking to his strength and his strong resolve to get the nation through the Civil War. However, on the other side, you have an open fist, sort of symbolizing reaching out, his charitable nature, reaching out to those with malice towards none, with charity for all. There are also many people who think that there is hidden symbolism in these hands. After all, Abraham Lincoln signed the charter to create the first ever school for the deaf in the United States. So there are some people who think that his hands are actually in sign language. The fist, of course, being the sign language letter for A, and then his open hand is actually forming the sign language letter L. So he is actually doing his initials, Abraham Lincoln, in sign language. Whether this was on purpose or not, the world may never know. Now, the sculpture was actually carved by a group of brothers in New York City called the Piccarelli brothers. You may know some of their other work. They are the ones who carved the lions outside the New York City Public Library. They also carved another interesting facet to anyone's DC trip, that being the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Now, here you have an image of the tomb guard in Arlington National Cemetery guarding the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Now, all the tomb guards are made up of the Army's 3rd U.S. Infantry. Now, it is a very strict process to have the honor and the privilege of serving as a tomb guard. It is said that to become a tomb guard is the second hardest to get military designation. The only military designation that is harder to get than being a tomb guard is becoming an astronaut. So think about all that these gentlemen and some ladies have to go through in order to serve their country in this way of guarding the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Now, as they are on their sentry post, it takes 21 steps and 21 seconds to go from one side of their sentry post to the other. The symbolism, of course, being 21 steps, 21 seconds, 21 gun salute, the highest military honor you can get as a sign of respect. Now, in this picture, that large tomb that you see that is above ground, that houses the remains of the unknown soldier of World War I. If you can see in ground, there are 3 other tombs. The tomb on the very far left houses the remains of the unknown soldier of World War II. The tomb on the very far right houses the remains of the unknown soldier from the Korean War. In the center, that tomb used to contain the remains of the unknown soldier of Vietnam. Note that I use the words used to. That tomb is empty right now. Why? Well, there were plenty of unknown remains for World War I, World War II, and the Korean War. However, due to an advancement in DNA technology during the Vietnam War, there were not unknown remains. In fact, the war ended in 1975. They didn't find a set of unknown, unidentifiable remains until the early 1980s. When they found those remains were immediately given all the honors that the other unknown soldiers got, and he was placed in that tomb. Now, in 1998, with such an increase in DNA technology, it was decided that that set of remains was going to be exhumed and tested to see if it would be able to be identified. They were able to identify the unknown Vietnam soldier as Air Force Captain Michael Blassie. Now, I'm speaking to you from St. Louis. Michael Blassie was from St. Louis, and as soon as he was identified, he was disinterred from Arlington National Cemetery, and he was buried here at home in St. Louis at our military cemetery at Jefferson Barracks. This is a snapshot of his tombstone. It is printed on both sides, and on the back side of his tomb, it does specify that he is was the unknown soldier between 1984 and 1998. That tomb, it was made the decision that it was going to remain empty, and the top of the tomb was re-engraved with the phrase, honoring and keeping faith with America's missing servicemen, 1958 to 1975, as a way to honor all the soldiers from the Vietnam War that are still listed as missing in action. Now, Arlington National Cemetery holds remains of every major U.S. conflict. It was started during the Civil War. Many of you probably know that Arlington National Cemetery once was Robert E. Lee's Arlington House and Plantation. It eventually became a cemetery during the Civil War. But it does contain remains that were disinterred and then reinterred in Arlington from the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. It also contains remains of astronauts from the Columbia and Challenger space shuttle disasters, as well as from the sinking of the USS Maine and the Iran hostage conflict. There are also soldiers from the Confederate Army that are buried here in Arlington National Cemetery. Their tombstones look different than everyone else's. Everyone else at Arlington National Cemetery, for the most part, has a tombstone similar to the one that Michael Blassi's is on screen, that Carrara marble simple stone. The Confederate ones, however, have a triangular shaped tip at the top. According to legend, this was done by the Confederate widows. They wanted a pointed topped tombstone so that, quote, no Yankees could sit on top of them. An interesting story there. Now, Arlington National Cemetery, of course, is in Virginia. Virginia, of course, was one of the southern states during the Civil War. Right across the Potomac River was Washington, D.C., of course, the capital of the Union. As soon as the Civil War ended, this bridge you are looking at was built. It is known as the Memorial Bridge, and it symbolically relinked the South and the North. Now, this image is of the beautiful National Cathedral. You may have seen the interior of this cathedral and not even known it. This is where, most recently, the state funerals of Senator John McCain and President George H.W. Bush were held. It is a fascinating sight. Now, on the outside of the cathedral, you will often find stone monsters known as gargoyles or grotesques. And on the National Cathedral, we have a very interesting grotesque on the outside. We have, in fact, popular American pop culture figure and Star Wars villain, Darth Vader, on the outside of the Washington National Cathedral to sort of celebrate American culture. Now, as I mentioned, this is a grotesque, not a gargoyle. So here's a fun fact for you. What is the difference between a gargoyle and a grotesque? Gargoyles are essentially rain spouts, are any monster, stone monster, that is able to spit water out of its mouth. Darth Vader here is not able to spit water out of his mouth, so he is known as a grotesque as opposed to a gargoyle. So there is your fun fact for the day. The inside of the cathedral has many stained glass windows, beautiful stained glass windows that tell the story of America. This window you're looking at right here is telling the story of American space travel. In the center of this photo, you may see a white ring with a black dot in the middle. That is actually a small bubble in the center of that stained glass window. And that black dot you're looking at is actually a slice of moon rock. So it's a bubble that contains nitrogen gas, and a slice of moon rock. Pretty cool. This is also the final resting place of President Woodrow Wilson. He helped see the nation through World War I, and he is the only president that is buried in Washington, D.C. itself. Now, of course, at Arlington National Cemetery, we have John F. Kennedy and President Taft buried, but that is in Virginia, not in D.C. itself. The National Cathedral is also the final resting place to some other famous names, notably Helen Keller and her teacher, the miracle worker, Annie Sullivan. Now, of course, Helen Keller, famous for being blind and deaf, and appropriately, her gravesite is marked with this bronze plaque that has Braille, so that the seeing impaired can read the inscription. You can see it's very well worn. It's a very popular place in the National Cathedral. Now let's talk a little bit about the White House. It's an old picture of the White House. It's home to every single commander-in-chief, except, of course, the first one, George Washington, never lived in the White House. The second president, John Adams, was the first president to ever live in the White House. Now, if we were able to go back in time and talk to John Adams, and you mentioned the White House, he would have no clue what you were talking about, because the White House was not always known as the White House. In fact, when he was living in it, the White House was actually a pale shade of yellow. It was not painted white until much later. It takes 400 gallons of white paint to paint the White House white, just in case you were wondering. But the original names of what we know today as the White House were the Executive Mansion or the Presidential Palace. It didn't change names until Theodore Roosevelt was president, and he was ordering new stationery for the Executive Mansion. All pieces of stationery said Executive Mansion. He thought that seemed a little bit too frou-frou, so he said, why don't we just call it what it is, a great big White House? So the new stationery, as soon as it was ordered, said the White House, and the name stuck until that point. Now here's a question for you. Here are two views of the White House. I often ask my students that I give tours to, which of these is the front door and which of these is the back door of the White House? And you get a variety of answers, and it's actually a trick question. The White House is maybe the only building in the world that does not have a back door. The White House plays host to many foreign leaders and dignitaries, and due to logistics, sometimes they have to go in one side or the other of the White House, and we never want foreign leaders to feel like they're being ushered in the back door. So what you are looking at in this picture are what are referred to on the left as the north front, and the picture to the right with the portico is the south front. So the White House is a building with two fronts and no back, so that way no foreign leader will ever be offended. Now, across from the White House in Lafayette Park is this statue of President Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson's statue is very interesting because he was considered a war hero during the War of 1812, when we were again fighting the British. This statue is actually made of melted down cannons and cannonballs that were captured from the British during that war. So it's pretty neat that the war that he was a hero of is now made of melted enemy cannons and cannonballs. Andrew Jackson was a very interesting president and just human being in general. He once was shot and he extracted the bullet from his own body using his bare fingers. He once killed a man for insulting his wife, and during his funeral, his pet parrot had to be removed from his funeral because the parrot kept cursing. That is a true story. Andrew Jackson's cursing parrot. How about that? All right. This gentleman right here, not a president. This is a man named James Smithson. Now, James Smithson was a very wealthy British citizen and scientist. He was also a bachelor. And when he died, he left all of his many, many millions of pounds to his nephew, with a caveat that his nephew would inherit all of his riches if his nephew produced an heir, had a child. Well, his nephew died childless, so the money was not inherited by his family, but instead went to Plan B. It went to the United States. Now, this is one of the mysteries of American history. James Smithson never once came to America. He was never here. So why did he leave us his money? The world can only guess. Many people think that he was inspired by American democracy. Now, he left us his money with the caveat that it be used for what was a very vague request, that it be used for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. All right, what does that mean? Well, Congress debated that for many, many years. Eventually, the money, which was equivalent to 1/66th of the entire United States budget at that time, huge chunk of money, was used to create the Smithsonian Institution. Now, the Smithsonian Institution today is a group of 19 museums, zoos, research facilities that are essentially a repository of United States history and culture. It contains 156 million artifacts, specimens, and pieces of art that tell the American story. So if you go to a Smithsonian institution, you may see some iconic American treasures, such as the Wright brothers' Kitty Hawk flyer on display at the Air and Space Museum, or perhaps the beautiful and supposedly cursed Hope Diamond on display at the Museum of Natural History. You can see Archie and Edith Bunker's armchairs from the TV show All in the Family at the American History Museum. The National Zoo was once home to this little bear cub that was saved from a forest fire in the state of Arizona. He came to live at the National Zoo, and he got a name, Smokey. So the original real-life inspiration for Smokey Bear, once called the Smithsonian Institution home. You can also today see an original pair of ruby slippers from The Wizard of Oz. You can see the original Star-Spangled Banner. It is a fascinating place. Now, the stories contained within these Smithsonian museums are often even communicated on the outside through their architecture. This building you are looking at right here is the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian. It tells the Native American experience of American history. This building is real close to the US Capitol. Now, the interesting thing about the architecture here is you will notice there are no 90-degree corners on this building. This is a building built without corners. That was due to the fact that many Native American and indigenous cultures, as part of their identity, they believe that evil spirits lurk in corners. So this building was built without corners. Now, if you've ever had a boss that you didn't like, that had a corner office, maybe the fact that evil spirits lurk in the corner is truthful, right? Now, one of the most popular exhibits in the Smithsonian is at the Museum of American History. It is an exhibit dedicated to the gowns of the first ladies of American history. Now, here's a question I have for you. Think to yourself, who was the first lady? Now, if you said Martha Washington, you would be absolutely incorrect. Now, don't get me wrong. Martha Washington was the first ever presidential spouse, but she was not the first lady. That distinction goes to a woman named Harriet Lane. Now, if you're racking your brain trying to think of a President Lane, you won't find one. We never had a President Lane, but we did have a President James Buchanan, pictured here. He was our country's only bachelor president. So he did not have a spouse, but he did live in the White House with his niece, who he loved. Her name was Harriet Lane. Now, the issue became, up until that point, the main woman of the White House was always referred to as Mrs. President. Now, of course, the members of the press couldn't refer to the president's niece as Mrs. President. That would seem very bizarre. So they had to come up with a new phrase for her, and that was First Lady. And that is how Harriet Lane became the first lady, and the name stuck. All right, one final story before I leave you today, and that is an ode to Washington's monument to traffic. If you're ever able to go to Washington, D.C., you will see all Washington, D.C. motorists with this license plate. Now, you will know during the Revolutionary War, one of our battle cries for independence was no taxation without representation. You will notice on this license plate, it does not have the no part. It says taxation without representation. Remember, Washington, the District of Columbia, is not a city. It is not a state. It is a district. And they do not have a voting member of Congress. So they literally are, as citizens of Washington, D.C., taxed without representation. And their license plates state that unabashedly. In the center of this, between the DA and the 983, you will see 3 red stars and 2 red bars. That is the flag of Washington, D.C. That is taken from the family coat of arms of our first Commander-in-Chief, George Washington. So there you go. We've gone through many, many years of American history in about 35 minutes. So hopefully you learned something very interesting. Again, I could go on for 3 days with other interesting stories about the many other buildings and monuments and memorials of DC, but hopefully that gave you a little taste and a little bit of an escape to our nation's capital today. So if anyone has any questions, I will certainly stick around. Otherwise, I thank you so much for allowing me into your space today. It was fun.